My parents called me stingy after I funded my brother's life for 3 years, but when I refused to pay. My name is Erika Bacciocchi. I'm 34, a civil rights attorney living in Seattle, and until recently, I believed that being the reliable one in the family meant being the one who gave without question. I didn't expect applause or recognition for it. I just thought that was what people like me did. People who had their lives together. People who didn't want to see their younger siblings crash. But the night my parents accused me of being selfish, of abandoning family after I'd quietly funneled over $70,000 into saving Jared from himself, something in me cracked. Not loudly, not violently. Just quietly. Like a fine fracture across glass that had been under pressure for too long. And in that moment, I realized they had no idea what it had cost me. Not just the money, but everything else. Growing up in Spokane, Washington, in a modest 2-story house near the river, the contrast between how Jared and I were treated wasn't subtle. I was the firstborn 5 years older, and I was the one who got told to be careful, to be responsible, to set a good example. Jared was the one who got told to enjoy being a kid while it lasted. Mom was an art teacher who loved eccentricity in others but expected perfection from me. Dad, a retired civil engineer, mostly kept quiet, especially when Jared's antics turned into incidents that required damage control. It started with broken vases and bad grades. It turned into unpaid parking tickets and bounced rent checks. But somehow Jared always managed to be trying his best, and I, no matter how much I did, was somehow always expected to understand. I moved out as soon as I turned 18. Got a scholarship to Stanford, worked 2 jobs to stay afloat, and graduated with honors. The years that followed were filled with courtrooms, late-night document reviews, and hard-won progress on civil rights cases that made me believe I was putting something good into the world. I didn't party. I didn't take vacations. I didn't accumulate things. What I did accumulate was stability. And to my family, stability looked like surplus. Like I had more than enough. So when Jared lost yet another job, this time for cursing at a customer during a food truck shift, Mom called me not to ask, but to gently suggest, maybe I could help him out just this once. "He listens to you, Erika," she said, like that was a compliment. "You've always been the one who kept him grounded. That just this once happened 4 years ago." What followed was a pattern I didn't recognize as dangerous until it had already devoured too much. First, I paid his rent, then his phone bill, then his car insurance. Each request came with a story. He was going to a job interview. He needed to keep his phone active in case someone called. He had a new lead on freelance design work that required upgraded software. Every story was urgent. Every story was temporary. And every story came with the same unspoken ending: I was the only one who could fix it. At first, I believed it. I thought I was doing what any good sibling would. And every time I wired him money, I told myself this was the last time. But then another emergency would come, and it always seemed cruel to say no when I had the means. I made spreadsheets. I set repayment plans. I wrote down goals with him on FaceTime, talking through how he could reframe his resume to attract steady clients. He nodded, smiled, promised, but nothing changed, except the amounts. Meanwhile, my own life began to feel smaller. My weekends with Reed, my partner, turned into tense evenings of managing Jared's crises. The vacation we'd planned to Oregon's wine country got canceled when Jared accidentally overdrafted his account and faced eviction. My kitchen remodel paused indefinitely. My retirement contributions started shrinking. Every time I adjusted my budget, I told myself it was temporary, that soon Jared would stand on his own. That I wasn't enabling him, I was investing in his potential. The shift came slowly. It wasn't one moment. It was many quiet moments layered together. The way Jared stopped saying thank you. The way my parents began to refer to my help as a given. The way I started hiding purchases from myself, hesitating before buying a new coat, because Jared might need something again. And yet when I finally said no, just once calmly after 3 years, they called me stingy. That word echoed. Stingy. As if I had been hoarding. As if I had not already spent not only money but time, energy, and pieces of myself, trying to keep someone else's life from unraveling. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just sat there on that late autumn evening, with the rain against the windows, and my mother's voice on speakerphone, asking how I could turn my back on family. And something settled in me, something final. It wasn't bitterness, it wasn't rage, it was clarity. I finally understood what I had to do next. But before I could reclaim myself, I had to confront the very people who had mistaken love for self-erasure. The first time I transferred money to Jared's account, it was $1800 to cover 3 months of unpaid rent. He had called me in a panic, whispering, because his roommate was asleep, and the landlord had left a final notice taped to the door. I remember sitting at my desk, still wearing a blazer from court, trying to understand how he had gotten that far behind, without telling anyone. I asked him why he hadn't called mom or dad. He told me they were already stressed with home repairs and probably couldn't help. That wasn't entirely true, but I didn't question it then. I just wired the money. It felt like the right thing to do. He said it would be a one-time thing. He had 2 job interviews lined up and promised me this would turn things around. I believed him. I always wanted to believe him. And maybe a part of me thought that if I stepped in early enough, I could stop the cycle before it became irreversible. What I didn't see coming was that cycle had already started long before I got involved. I was just replacing whoever had carried him last. After that first payment, things escalated slowly. The next month, it was a missed utility bill. Then it was his car battery dying. Then groceries. Each request came with a new justification. Each reason felt urgent, almost tragic in the way he presented it, and I kept rationalizing that he just needed a little longer to catch up. I wasn't naive. I created a spreadsheet to track what he owed me, added due dates, even included interest-free flexibility. I sent him copies and walked him through it. I asked him to send me job application updates every Friday. I offered to review his cover letters, even rewrite them when needed. I helped him apply for a city-sponsored financial literacy course, which he attended for exactly 2 sessions, before claiming the instructor was condescending, and the whole thing felt judgmental. Meanwhile, I kept paying. Quietly. Sometimes guiltily. I didn't tell Reed how much had already gone out. I didn't mention it to my friend Talia, even though she would have seen right through it. I started skipping brunch plans and movie nights, telling myself I needed rest, when really I was watching my bank balance recalculate after every transfer. Every time I pressed submit, I felt smaller. Like I was slowly becoming a backup generator to someone else's life while mine kept dimming. The worst part was that Jared wasn't cruel. He didn't yell. He didn't manipulate in obvious ways. He made me laugh when he wanted to. He remembered birthdays. He had a way of making me feel like I was the only person who ever understood him, so when he missed a repayment, I let it slide. When he forgot to check in about job interviews, I didn't press. When I saw a tagged Instagram story of him at a rooftop bar the same day, he said he'd been too sick to job hunt. I told myself maybe he was networking. But the stories kept unraveling. A client he was designing for supposedly disappeared without paying. His laptop broke, so I bought him a new one. He needed dental work, so I covered the deductible. His phone was disconnected, so I added him to my family plan. Every problem that surfaced became mine to fix, and every fix invited a new complication. The idea of helping someone I loved had somehow twisted into a quiet form of ownership. I felt responsible for his failure, even as he made no effort to change. My parents, instead of stepping in, began using my support as proof that Jared was trying. He wouldn't accept help if he wasn't serious, my mom said one night, as if accepting free assistance was a sign of maturity. Dad sent me articles about adult siblings starting businesses together. A subtle hint, perhaps, that I should think bigger. They didn't see the weight I was carrying because I never let it show. I smiled through holiday dinners. I brought wine. I gave Jared gift cards for Christmas because giving cash started to feel awkward. Then came the first crack. It was a Friday night in January. Jared called cheerful for once. He said he and his new girlfriend Zoe were planning a weekend trip to Santa Barbara. He wanted to know if I could help with hotel costs. She's never been, he said, like that was the justification I needed. When I paused, he shifted quickly. I mean, I'll pay you back, he added. Obviously. That call didn't end in a fight. I just said I'd think about it. Then I sat on my couch, stared at the blank television screen, and tried to remember the last time I'd taken a trip anywhere. I couldn't. My last vacation had been 3 years ago, right before Jared's first eviction. Since then, every travel plan had been delayed, rebooked, or canceled. I still had a suitcase in my closet with unused luggage tags. That night, I didn't sleep much. My mind kept drifting between guilt and resentment, between love and clarity. I realized something had shifted in me. I wasn't mad at Jared. I was mad at myself for letting it get this far, for confusing sacrifice with love, for forgetting that the more I gave him, the less he gave himself. That was the night I opened my spreadsheet again. I stared at the total $47,830 across 26 months, and I knew the number was about to grow unless I did something drastic. Not angry, not impulsive. Just final. The next morning, I didn't answer Jared's text. It was short, just a casual check-in asking if I'd had time to think about Santa Barbara, followed by a palm tree emoji. I stared at it for a while before putting my phone down. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because I finally knew that any answer I gave would come with consequences. If I said yes, the pattern would continue. If I said no, I would become the villain in his version of the story. I wasn't sure I was ready for that role yet. Later that week, I scheduled a meeting with Eliza, my financial planner. We hadn't met in over a year. When she pulled up my account history, her eyebrows pinched. I knew what she was seeing. Steady withdrawals labeled as family support, a significant dip in retirement contributions, a noticeable stall in my long-term investment account. She didn't scold me. She just asked questions. Where was the money going? Was there a plan for reimbursement? Was this support open-ended or part of a transition strategy? I gave her half answers and vague phrases like, for now and just temporary, but by the end of the session I admitted the truth. There was no plan. I had created a dependency I didn't know how to walk away from without burning everything down. Eliza didn't pressure me, but her final slide made things unavoidably clear. At this rate, she said I'd need to work an extra 9 to 10 years before retirement. My silence was answer enough. That night, I couldn't concentrate on anything. I sat on the floor of my bedroom, with my laptop opened the spreadsheet, and turned it into something bigger. I categorized every dollar spent: rent, utilities, food, transportation, medical, phone bills, credit card payments, impulse loans. Then I added dates, notes, promises that were never kept, apologies that faded into new requests. I color-coded each column. Yellow for housing, blue for emergencies, red for everything that was supposed to be paid back and never was. By the time I was done, the total had passed $65,000. I stared at the number until my eyes blurred. The document didn't lie. It showed every small compromise that had slowly hollowed out my life. I printed it, not out of spite, not as ammunition, but because I needed proof, not for them, for me, proof that I hadn't exaggerated, that I wasn't overreacting, that the heaviness I felt wasn't something I had imagined. The paper was weightless, but what it held wasn't. I knew I couldn't just stop overnight. That would only turn me into a monster in my family's eyes. So I created a 3-month exit plan. I wrote it like a contract, 1 page, clear terms. I'd continue basic support for 90 days, while Jared searched for full-time work. I included links to free job placement services, financial counseling, and low-income housing resources. I offered to help with his resume, make introductions, check in weekly. But after those 90 days, financial assistance would end. Permanently. Before I shared it with Jared, I needed to talk to someone outside the storm. I called Talia. We met the next day at a quiet cafe, the kind with small tables and strong coffee that tasted like resolve. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, just nodding as I spoke. When I finished, she exhaled and said, "It's not love if it's destroying you." Her words didn't come from judgment. They came from experience. Her younger sister had gone through a similar spiral years ago, and she'd had to draw the same painful lines. That weekend, I invited Jared to meet for coffee. He showed up 15 minutes late, wearing sunglasses indoors and scrolling his phone as he walked in. He greeted me like nothing was wrong. I handed him the envelope. He laughed at first. Thought it was some kind of joke. When he realized it wasn't, his face changed. Not to shame or regret, but to offense. He flipped through the pages, like it was a betrayal. "So you've been keeping receipts," he muttered like that made me petty. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain what the spreadsheet already did. Then I handed him the transition plan. He read it once and shook his head. "You're cutting me off," he said, his voice flat. I told him I was giving him a path forward with boundaries. That I would still support him emotionally, but the money had to stop. He scoffed, called it cold, accused me of letting Reed get in my head. I let the insults pass. I didn't defend myself. I only said one thing that mattered. If I keep helping you like this, I'm not helping you grow. I'm keeping you stuck. He stood up without finishing his drink. No goodbye. Just a shake of his head and a sarcastic thanks for the love. As I watched him walk out, I felt both lighter and lonelier than I had in years. The goodbye hadn't sounded like a door slamming. It had sounded like the quiet thud of something long overdue. I didn't hear from Jared for almost 2 weeks after that meeting. Not a text, not a call, not a sarcastic meme or a passive-aggressive story post. At first I expected the silence to break quickly. I thought he might reach out with anger or guilt, try to talk me out of it. But what came instead was worse. It was delegation. The first message came from my mom on a Wednesday afternoon. She wrote like she always did when she was trying not to upset me. "Hey sweetie, just checking in. Jared mentioned you two had a talk. I know things have been tense, but maybe we can all talk this weekend." There was no question mark at the end of her sentence. Just a suggestion disguised as a gentle invitation. I replied that I was busy, which was true. But I also wasn't ready to be sat down like a rebellious teenager and scolded for daring to draw a line. Then came my dad. His message was shorter. "We need to talk about Jared. Don't make any decisions you can't undo." That one landed hard. It didn't ask if I was okay. It didn't acknowledge anything Jared might have done. It was just a warning. And behind it, I could already hear the familiar rhythm of the family script playing out again. Erika fixes. Jared stumbles. Parents smooth it over. I decided to confront it head-on. I cleared my weekend and drove back to Spokane. The house looked smaller than I remembered, though nothing had changed physically. Just the feeling. When I walked in, the air felt dense. Mom offered tea. Dad was sitting stiffly in his recliner. Jared was already on the couch, legs crossed, looking out the window, like this was something happening to him, not because of him. The conversation began as expected. Mom said she was worried about how cutting support so suddenly might affect Jared's mental health. Dad said families don't abandon each other when times are hard. Jared didn't say much at first. He let them talk for him like he always had. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I waited until they were done painting me as the one who had changed. Then I pulled out my copy of the spreadsheet. I connected it to their living room television with an HDMI cable. The numbers filled the screen. The categories, the dates, the total. My mom's jaw tightened. My dad leaned forward like he was trying to read something impossible. Jared didn't flinch. He had seen it before, but I needed them to see it now. Not pieces. The whole picture. I walked them through it calmly. I explained the support wasn't a few favors. It wasn't generosity taken too far. It was a full financial ecosystem that had drained over $65,000 from my savings. It was money I had set aside for a future I no longer felt I could build. A future that included a home, a child, a life where I wasn't someone's emergency exit every month. I talked about vacations canceled, contributions paused, therapy sessions I needed just to breathe again. When I finished, the room was silent. For the first time, my parents didn't have a quick answer. My mom looked like someone had just rewritten the story she'd believed for years. My dad was still holding his coffee, but hadn't taken a sip. It was Jared who broke the silence. He shrugged and said, "You could afford it. What's the big deal?" That sentence hit harder than anything else. It didn't matter how carefully I had explained it. To him, money was still abstract. Responsibility was still optional. He didn't see the cost because he never felt it. And my parents, to their credit, didn't rush to defend him this time. They just looked at him, really looked in a way I hadn't seen before. The conversation ended without resolution. I told them my plan remained the same. 3 months. No more. I'd support him emotionally. I'd help him look for work, but the money would stop. I kissed my mother on the cheek. I shook my father's hand. Jared didn't look at me as I left. He just pulled out his phone. Back in Seattle, I expected the fallout to come quickly. Angry texts, hurtful calls. Instead, I got silence. A cold, clean kind of silence that stretched for days. Then the cracks began to show. I got a call from Jared's landlord asking if I knew when rent would be paid. I told him I didn't. Then a message from his internet provider forwarded to my email. Jared had used my information as a backup contact. I ignored it. I deleted it. I reminded myself this wasn't cruelty. This was clarity. 3 weeks into the transition period, Jared was evicted. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just methodically the way systems work when deadlines are ignored. He moved back in with our parents who suddenly had to face what they'd outsourced for 3 years. Calls from creditors, grocery bills, emotional meltdowns over job rejections. They didn't say it outright, but I could hear it in their voices. This wasn't what they expected. But it had always been real. They had just never had to carry it. The first few weeks after Jared moved back home were strangely quiet on my end. No one called to ask for anything. No emotional check-ins, no guilt-laced suggestions about how I could just help a little to ease the transition. At first I thought maybe they were trying to prove a point. That they could handle it. That maybe I had overreacted. But I knew the silence wasn't resolution. It was accumulation. And eventually it would break. It did not with a confrontation, but with a late-night call from my mom. Her voice was different this time. She wasn't angry. She wasn't performative. She just sounded tired. She asked if we could talk the next day. No pretext. No build-up. I agreed. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't rehearse anything in my head before that call. When we spoke, she admitted they were struggling to keep up. Jared had maxed out their grocery budget. He'd borrowed Dad's car without asking and returned it with a broken taillight. He'd promised to contribute to utilities, then spent the money on gaming accessories. "We thought we understood him," she said quietly. "We didn't. I didn't say I told you so. I didn't need to." It wasn't the moment for that. She wasn't calling to defend him. She was finally seeing the picture I had shown her in numbers and silence. Around that same time I started noticing changes in myself. Not dramatic ones. Just the slow return of space. I could focus at work again, without that low hum of dread in the back of my mind. Reed and I started planning trips again, not to escape something, but because we finally had the freedom to dream without waiting for the next emergency. I started reading novels again. I lit candles and didn't think about the electricity bill. My bank account began to look familiar again. Not overflowing, but calm. Predictable. Jared didn't reach out. Not for weeks. Not until the eviction from our parents' house became a real possibility. He'd missed 3 job interviews, slept through one, showed up late to another, and walked out of the third claiming the manager gave him bad energy. When my dad finally told him he would need to pay rent or leave, Jared reacted like he was being punished for existing. The same pattern repeated. He blamed the system, the market, his mental health, his girlfriend, his allergies. Everything except the fact that he had never once followed through on anything beyond the first 2 steps. I knew he would call me again. And he did. One Saturday morning, right as I was leaving for the farmer's market. I let it go to voicemail. His message was long. Some parts sounded sincere. He said he missed talking to me. That things had been hard. That he was reevaluating everything. But the last part revealed what hadn't changed. He mentioned a new certification program in graphic design and asked if I could help with tuition. "Just until I'm on my feet," he said. The phrase I had heard at least a dozen times before. I sat with it for an hour. I listened again. And then I replied with something short and direct. I told him I was proud of him for wanting to learn something new, that I hoped he would follow through, that I'd be happy to help him review his resume again or find online resources, but that I wasn't in a position to offer financial support anymore. It wasn't a punishment, it was a boundary. I ended with the same sentence I had written in the transition letter. "This is the most loving thing I can do for both of us." He didn't reply. At least not directly. But I heard from my dad 3 days later. Jared had found a part-time job in a warehouse. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't match his idea of who he thought he was. But it was steady. It had a schedule. It had consequences. And for the first time, he was the one choosing to stay. I don't romanticize that shift. I know it didn't happen because of a single decision or moment. It happened because there were no other exits left. Because I stopped patting the floor beneath him. Because my parents finally stopped deflecting. And because deep down Jared knew something had to give. Later that month, Mom called again. This time, not to talk about Jared, but to ask about me, how work was going. If Reed and I were still planning to visit Portland in the spring. She didn't mention money. She didn't suggest anything. It was the first conversation in years where I felt like a daughter, instead of a financial extension of the family's problems. That's when I realized that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for a family dynamic isn't to save it, but to let it feel its own weight. Because people rarely change when someone else is always absorbing the consequences. They change when silence replaces rescue, when boundaries become undeniable, when love stops being confused with sacrifice. By the time spring rolled in, things had shifted in small but undeniable ways. Jared was still working at the warehouse, still complaining occasionally about the early hours and the repetitive tasks, but he hadn't quit. That alone was something. My parents were slowly adjusting too. The calls became more balanced. Less about Jared's struggles and more about everyday things. My mom's new gardening project, my dad's knee acting up again, a neighbor getting a new puppy. It felt almost normal, and that in itself felt strange. There were still moments that tested my resolve, like when Jared's birthday came around and Mom hinted that maybe I could do a little something extra since he was trying so hard. Or when I heard from a mutual friend that he had posted a fundraiser for new camera equipment and tagged it rebuilding from scratch. The old me would have clicked the link, felt obligated, maybe even donated anonymously. But I didn't. I let it exist without reacting. Because rebuilding isn't something you outsource. It's something you decide to do for yourself. Meanwhile, my life started to open up in ways I hadn't expected. Reed and I took the Portland trip we had postponed for nearly 2 years. It wasn't extravagant. Just 4 days at a modest inn near the coast, long walks, quiet meals, bookstore browsing. But it felt like oxygen, like reclaiming something we had both put on hold too long. One night, as we sat on the patio with coffee and rain misting the edge of the light, Reed looked at me and said, "This version of you is lighter." I knew exactly what he meant. At work, I said yes to a new litigation project I had previously turned down because I was too distracted, the kind of case that required focus and energy and emotional bandwidth. I had that again, and it showed. My managing director took notice. My colleagues began including me in strategy meetings again, no longer unsure of whether I had the space to commit fully. I wasn't just showing up, I was present. Around that time, Talia and I met for lunch, something we used to do regularly before my world had shrunk into emergency management. Over avocado toast and ginger tea, she smiled and said, "You look like yourself again." I laughed and replied, "I'm still figuring out who that is." But I knew what she meant. I had spent so long adjusting my life around someone else's needs that I had lost track of my own baseline. Now it was coming back to me, piece by piece. Then something happened that I hadn't expected. Jared called not for money, not for help, but to ask if I wanted to meet for coffee. I hesitated. I almost said no out of instinct, but something told me to go. We met at a local cafe, one I knew well, neutral territory. He looked different, less frantic. A little older somehow. He didn't talk much at first. Just sipped his drink and looked uncomfortable in that way people do when they've come to say something hard. When he finally spoke, it wasn't a speech. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. He just said, "I didn't realize how much you were holding." I didn't rush to fill the silence. He kept going. "I thought you were just being distant, but I see it now. I leaned on you like it was nothing. I never really thought about what it cost you." I listened, unsure of what to say. Then he added something I didn't expect. "I'm not there yet, but I'm trying to stay on track. And I get why you stopped. I really do." He didn't ask for anything. Not even forgiveness. Just understanding. And maybe a second chance not to get money, but to be in my life again without hurting it. That conversation didn't solve everything, but it did something more important. It shifted the tone. It gave us a starting point that wasn't about blame or balance sheets or who owed whom. It was just human. Real. Imperfect. But honest. Later that night, I wrote in my journal for the first time in months. Not about Jared, not about family, just about where I was. About how silence had taught me more than any argument ever could. About how boundaries weren't walls, they were bridges with tolls. About how letting go wasn't about punishment, but about letting people meet their own lives with both hands, instead of always expecting a rescue line. What I had done wasn't radical. It wasn't even new. It was just something we rarely talk about out loud. The decision to stop performing survival for someone else. to stop being the fallback plan for people who refuse to build their own. There was something different about the weeks that followed that coffee with Jared. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't marked by any major milestone or apology tour. But there was a noticeable shift in how we both moved through each other's orbit. He stopped using his problems as reasons to reach out and started using progress. I'd get the occasional text, now short but meaningful. A photo of his lunch packed in Tupperware with the caption, "Trying." A screenshot of a paycheck. A blurry picture of a bus schedule he was sticking to instead of borrowing someone's car. It wasn't perfect, but it was effort. And for the first time in years, it felt like effort that didn't ask me to carry it. My parents noticed it too. Not just Jared's shift, but mine. They stopped tiptoeing around the subject of money. They stopped positioning me as the backup plan. My mom started including me in light conversations again. Recipes, books, she'd finally started reading little updates about neighbors I hadn't thought about since high school. Dad even called once just to talk about a documentary we had both watched. No underlying motive. It felt cautious but real, like everyone was relearning how to interact without the weight of unspoken expectations. Of course, some moments still stung. Like when I found out Jared had borrowed money from one of our cousins to cover a parking ticket he didn't want to tell our parents about. Old patterns die hard and accountability takes time. But even then, something felt different. He paid the cousin back a week later. Not because anyone forced him, but because, as he later admitted, I didn't want to owe anyone anything again. That line stayed with me longer than I expected. One Saturday, while cleaning out a cabinet in my apartment, I found a folder full of the old spreadsheets, the ones I had obsessively updated during the worst months of his dependence. It hit me how much mental real estate I had given to managing someone else's adulthood. Dates, line items, annotations in red when things went unpaid too long. Notes about promises I had believed. A record not just of finances but of misplaced hope. I thought about shredding it, but instead I slipped it into an envelope, labeled it, closed, and stored it in a drawer. Not to forget, but to remember I had survived it. Around that time, Reed and I sat down one evening and had a different kind of conversation. We'd been living in a kind of holding pattern for years, both emotionally and financially, waiting for things to settle. Now, for the first time, we talked about what moving forward could really look like. Buying a house, maybe starting a family, planning a wedding we could actually enjoy without guilt or compromise. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't fantasy. It was grounded. Earned. We knew what we had fought through to arrive at this point, and we respected it. In the middle of all that, Jared sent a message that surprised me. He said he had enrolled in a local community college program for digital logistics and warehouse operations. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't what he used to dream about when he said he wanted to be a filmmaker or a traveling designer, but it was something that made sense for him now. Structure, schedules, training. A start. He told me he was paying for it himself. I congratulated him. Not like an older sister patting a child on the head, but like someone who knew how hard that first real choice could be. A month later, he called me from a bus stop. Said he had just passed his first test and wanted to share it with someone who would actually be proud of him. I told him I was. And I meant it. Not because he had finally succeeded, but because he was finally failing forward. He was doing the hard, unremarkable things that build a life. And he was doing it without expecting applause or bailout. It wasn't lost on me how far we had come. Not just Jared. All of us. My parents had slowly stopped avoiding their discomfort and started confronting their blind spots. They acknowledged things now that would have once been dismissed as exaggeration. They didn't always get it right, but they were trying. And I saw in them the same thing I saw in myself and in Jared. Tired people finally choosing change, even if they were late to the lesson. What I had feared would tear my family apart had actually peeled something false away. Underneath the guilt and obligation, there was still love. But now it was growing into something more honest, more durable. Not because everything was fixed, but because the pretending had stopped. As summer approached, I started noticing the absence of fear. Not just in daily logistics or my bank account, but in the smaller moments that used to be filled with quiet dread. No part of me was bracing for a sudden phone call about overdraft notices, overdue rent, or a car breaking down in the middle of nowhere. I no longer opened my inbox expecting to find another guilt-laced request disguised as an emergency. What replaced that old anxiety wasn't celebration. It was something softer, more grounding. Reed and I began touring homes again. We weren't in a rush, but this time the conversations felt more real. We talked about neighborhoods not in terms of resale value, but in terms of community. We talked about rooms for a future child, about how many windows a kitchen should have, about things people only dream of when they're not constantly plugging leaks in someone else's life. That fall, we found a modest house near Ravenna Park. It wasn't flashy, it didn't need to be, it was enough. And this time I didn't have to do the math twice to be sure I could afford it. After the offer was accepted, my mom called genuinely excited. She wanted to help us paint the guest room. My dad offered to build some shelves. No one mentioned Jared. No one slipped in a question about whether I might set aside a little something for him too. It was the first major decision I'd made where their support didn't come tangled in obligation. I didn't realize how much that meant until I was standing in the empty living room, keys in hand, and cried not out of exhaustion but out of quiet relief. Jared sent a short message the day we moved in. Saw the pics. Looks like a good place. Proud of you. That was it. No subtext, no hidden ask. Just a sentence that acknowledged a boundary without bitterness. It meant more than any apology ever could. Later that month, he invited me to his community college's open day. He had completed his first term, passed all his classes, and wanted to show me the campus. I almost said no. Not because I was angry or guarded, but because I wasn't sure I could handle walking into his world again without trying to fix something. But I went, and what I saw surprised me. He wasn't pretending to be someone he wasn't anymore. He wasn't dressed in some curated persona or trying to impress anyone. He was just there, grounded, focused. When he introduced me to his classmates, he didn't downplay our history or make a joke out of it. He simply said, "This is my sister. She helped me see things clearer." It was the closest he had ever come to acknowledging what I had done without asking for more. And in that moment I realized how much I had needed to hear that. Not for validation, just for truth. On the drive home, I thought about how different things had been just a year earlier. I remembered the exhaustion, the therapy sessions where I had to learn how to say no without flinching, the fear of being painted as ungrateful, cold, or selfish. I remembered how I used to calculate every decision not just for myself, but for how it might ripple into someone else's chaos. I thought about how many people live like that for years, decades, even trapped by the expectation that love means surrender, and that boundaries mean betrayal. But I had learned something different. I had learned that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's survival for someone at the cost of someone else's wholeness. I had learned that guilt is not a reliable compass, and that the people who truly care about you will eventually respect your limits even if they fight them at first. I had learned that letting someone fall is sometimes the kindest thing you can do, not because you want them to fail, but because protecting them from the consequences never really helped them grow. Jared wasn't a different person entirely. He still had rough edges, still moved slower than the world demanded, still resisted structure some days. But he wasn't coasting anymore. He was building slowly, one honest step at a time. And more importantly, he was doing it with his own effort on his own clock. For the first time, I could see a future where I wasn't his fallback. I was just his sister. And that was enough. There's a kind of healing that happens quietly without fireworks or declarations. It looks like small choices, like skipped impulse purchases, like bus rides instead of Uber, like waking up on time, like answering messages with honesty instead of manipulation. It's not spectacular. It's not social media worthy. But it's real. And it lasts. Fall came with a quiet rhythm. The days shortened, the mornings carried a bite of cold, and our new house slowly began to feel like home. Reed spent weekends setting up the office we both would share. And I took pleasure in the smallest domestic rituals, organizing drawers, labeling spices, choosing curtains, not out of necessity, but out of care. There was something healing about claiming a space without fear that it would be interrupted by a crisis I didn't cause. That season, I accepted an invitation to speak at a regional legal conference. It wasn't the first time I'd been asked, but it was the first time in 3 years I had the energy to say yes. I spoke about sustainable advocacy, about the dangers of burnout in civil rights work, and about the personal cost of overfunctioning. The room was quiet during my closing. When I stepped off stage, a woman approached me and said, "I think you just described my entire relationship with my brother." I smiled, not with superiority, but with solidarity. The details always vary, but the weight feels familiar. After the conference, I stopped by Spokane for a weekend. It wasn't planned as a dramatic return, it was just a casual visit. Mom wanted help reorganizing the garage, and Dad had promised to grill if the weather held. Jared was there when I arrived. He didn't avoid me, but he didn't rush to greet me either. That was fine. We were in a new season now, and I was learning to accept whatever people offered without expecting more than they could give. We spent most of the first day doing errands, moving boxes, clearing shelves, tossing things that had been kept out of habit, not meaning. At one point, while sorting through a stack of old electronics, Jared looked up and asked if I remembered when he tried to build a drone in high school. I did. He spent weeks obsessed with it, then abandoned it halfway when he couldn't get the wiring right. I've never been good at finishing things, he said, not as a joke, not fishing for reassurance. Just stating it like a man, finally telling the truth to himself. I didn't try to correct him. I just said, starting again counts too. And we moved on. That night, as we sat around the patio table eating charred burgers and roasted corn, I noticed something else had changed. My parents didn't hover around. Jared didn't narrate his progress like a sales pitch, didn't look to me for approval or funding. They simply let him be. When the conversation turned toward my work, they listened without pivoting to how Jared might benefit. And for the first time, I felt like I was allowed to be proud without guilt. After dinner, Jared offered to walk with me around the block. It was cool out, the sky fading into deep blue, the street lamps humming as they flickered on. We didn't say much for a while. Then he said, "I know I cost you a lot." I waited, unsure where he was headed. "Not just money. I mean time, attention, space in your head." I nodded, letting the words settle. He didn't fill the silence with excuses. He just kept walking beside me. Then more quietly he added, "I don't know if I'll ever make it up to you, but I'm trying to live like I remember." I stopped walking and looked at him, not searching for signs of sincerity, just recognizing a person I'd spent years carrying finally starting to carry himself. "That's all I ever wanted," I said. And I meant it. When I drove back to Seattle the next morning, there was no heaviness, no unspoken dread, no suspicion that a new crisis would follow me. I turned on music, stopped for coffee halfway, and let the silence feel like freedom instead of tension. When I walked back into our house, Reed was setting out mugs and slicing apples. "How was it?" he asked, not as someone bracing for impact, but as someone genuinely interested. I answered with a smile I hadn't used in a long time. "Different," I said. "In a good way." Later that week, I pulled the envelope of old spreadsheets from the drawer, opened it one last time, and took a deep breath. I didn't feel resentment or regret. Just a strange, deep gratitude that I had chosen to stop when I did. That I had learned in time the difference between helping and enabling. Between love and erasure. Between duty and dignity. A few months later, Jared invited me to his certification ceremony. It wasn't a grand event, just a small recognition hosted by the community college for the students who had completed the logistics program. There were no tuxedos, no dramatic speeches, just folding chairs, coffee in paper cups, and a few proud families holding their phones up with quiet hope. I almost didn't go. Not because I didn't care, but because some part of me still flinched at the idea of being dragged back into old roles. But I knew this time was different. He wasn't asking for anything but my presence. So I drove the 2 hours, walked into the rec hall, and found my seat in the third row. When his name was called, he walked up slowly, tucked shirt, clean shoes, shoulders back. There was no smirk, no bravado, no nervous glance in my direction. Just calm. He accepted the certificate, shook hands with his instructor, and returned to his seat with quiet dignity. After the ceremony, he came over and said, "I wanted you here, because I wouldn't have gotten here if you hadn't stopped helping me." It wasn't dramatic. He didn't cry. Neither did I. But the truth of it hung between us with more weight than all the years we had wasted trying to fix what wasn't ready. On the drive back, I thought about how different this chapter of my life had turned out, compared to what I used to imagine. When I was younger, I believed healing would look like a movie scene. Some big moment of redemption, a family reunited under soft lighting, someone delivering a perfect apology while everyone else clapped or cried. But now, older and steadier, I understand something deeper. Healing is often quiet. It doesn't ask to be noticed. It happens when people start showing up differently, even if they're late. One evening, not long after I was standing in our kitchen making dinner, while Reed set the table. I looked out the window at the slow sunset stretching over the neighborhood, and felt a sense of completion I hadn't known I was waiting for. Not because everything was perfect. It wasn't. But because I was no longer living in reaction to someone else's damage, I had become the center of my own story again. That night, I wrote a final journal entry about Jared. I wrote not to close a wound but to honor the long road of boundary setting and what it had cost. I wrote about how hard it was to stop helping when helping made me feel needed. I wrote about the guilt, the pushback, the silence from people who didn't understand. I wrote about how some lessons you only learn when you risk being called selfish. And I wrote about how peace doesn't come from people changing. It comes from refusing to lose yourself while waiting for them to. A few weeks later, my parents came to visit. We cooked together, took long walks, even visited the little bookstore around the corner. We didn't talk much about the past. It wasn't necessary. What mattered was the atmosphere had changed. There was no tightness in my chest, no bracing for disappointment. My mom pulled me aside before they left and said, "You taught us something, even if it took us too long to see it." That was all she said. And that was enough. There's a quiet kind of power in drawing a line not to punish others, but to protect what's sacred inside yourself. That's what this story was always about. Not revenge, not exposure, not a dramatic takedown. Just a woman learning to stop bleeding for people who didn't want to stop cutting and choosing to step back without closing the door completely. Just enough space for them to walk through it on their own. If you've ever been called stingy for saving yourself first, if you've ever been made to feel guilty for refusing to carry what was never yours, know this: you are not cruel for reclaiming your peace. You are not selfish for choosing sustainability over sacrifice. Sometimes, the most generous thing you can do for someone else is to stop making their problems your job. And sometimes walking away quietly speaks louder than all the screaming in the world. So if you're still in the middle of your own version of this story, wondering if setting boundaries will make you the villain, remember this: the people who grow will understand eventually. And the ones who don't were never really rooting for your healing in the first place. Have you ever been called selfish just because you said no? How did you respond? And what did it cost you to finally stop explaining yourself?